Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com.
Welcome to the July Community IT Innovators webinar. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on crafting nonprofit security policy. This webinar is a complete refresh of one of our most popular webinars of all time on IT security policy from just over 2 years ago. Good afternoon, my name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I am the President and CEO of Community IT and the moderator for this series. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our company. Community IT is a 100% employee-owned company. Our team of almost 40 staff is dedicated to helping nonprofit organizations advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We are technology experts, and were recently named again a top Washington, D.C. based managed services provider for the third year in a row, I think, by MSP Mentor. And now it's my pleasure to welcome today's presenter and our Chief Technology Officer at Community IT, Matthew Eshelman. Hi, Matt.
Hey, thanks for the intro, Johan. Yeah, it's great to see that recognition continue again from MSP Mentor. And yeah, again, good to be in the top MSPs based here in DC. I know I just actually looked at my calendar. I actually started as an intern at Community IT 17 years ago on Monday. So it's been great to be a part of this company and to be an employee owner. So I'm looking forward to today's topic. And before we really jump into it, I did want to provide this list of resources for some kind of background reading. So we'll start at the top. At the beginning of last year, we co-sponsored the Idealware Security report, and that's a great resource. We have also developed our own Community IT Security Playbook, which is available as a download from our website. And we've done a number of security-focused webinars, and so this is really building on some of the previous webinars that we have done. So this webinar and all previous webinars are available on our YouTube channel and also available on our SlideShare page. If you are late attending, or if you're not going to be able to stay for the whole thing, don't worry. You will get a copy of the webinar and slide deck pretty soon after the session is completed. And then I've added an additional link here. Since we're talking about IT security policy, I wanted to provide a reference link to a really great resource from SANS and their security policy templates. So this is a resource that is kind of free and publicly available and can be a great place to look to start. So if you're looking to get started with an IT policy or looking to make sure that you kind of have all of your bases covered, this is a really great resource for getting ideas for those policy templates and building from there. So this graphic is taken from our IT playbook that kind of talks about our comprehensive view, our holistic view of how Community IT thinks of security. And so there's a lot of different things. We've got predictive intelligence on the top. We've got kind of over-top passwords and antivirus and backups and patching. That's kind of on security training and awareness. And then down at the bottom, we have the foundation, which is written and updated policies. So, it is a little bit interesting that we're now doing this webinar on written and update and kind of developing a policy, which is kind of on the heels of some more specific topics that we've had focused on, single sign-on, security breaches, and some other things. So we did want to make sure that we were looping back. As Johan mentioned, we did a security policy webinar about 2 years ago, and so this is an update on that. And I think if you have watched that webinar and then compared to this one, I think there's certainly an evolution or a change in how we're now kind of seeing and thinking about IT security policies. So as we go along, we have a great list of questions that folks submitted ahead of time. Please feel free to chat in questions, and Johan will be monitoring that and interjecting as applicable, and if not, we will answer questions at the end. So we're together for about an hour today and attempt to make the best use of our time. Just some basic terminology. So we're talking about policies, and again, those policies are the principles, rules, and guidelines formulated or adopted by an organization to reach its long-term goals. So that's kind of the framework that we're talking about today. Guidelines, again, they're recommended practices, get some discretion, some leeway, like, hey, these are some good ideas. These are the guardrails. We have standards, which would be universally accepted or established meanings. So, we, may say, hey, we're going to use, the AES 128 encryption standard as something that we are going to mandate as part of our communication. So that would be a standard. And then we've got procedures that really talk about, how all these things get put into place, how we really take the policy and put them into action. So again, it's always good to start with a little bit of background terminology so that we're all on the same page in terms of definitions and as we move forward. So there were a number of questions that were asked ahead of time about what policies to have and kind of where should we start. And there's a couple of items on here, acceptable use policy, data policy, an identity account policy, and then HIPAA. So I think, as we have seen, organizations, operate in action and kind of be exposed to different security threats, this, I think, follows what I see as, kind of the biggest priorities in terms of what organizations need to focus on. Often, the acceptable use policy is something, that is already, most organizations already have. That's typically part of, maybe your employee handbook, and it, oftentimes describes kind of good computer behavior. Don't look at, websites you're not supposed to. Your computer is to be used for business purposes. There may be things like you don't have an expectation of privacy. We're monitoring, kind of what we have, the IT department has the ability to monitor things, kind of so on and so forth. So I think the acceptable use policy is often a great place to start. If you don't have anything, that's probably where you should start. And if you are, an organization kind of looking to build out, the acceptable use policy provides a framework or a way to insert or add additional policies into something that already exists. So again, I mentioned the acceptable use policy will often describe, how to handle computer equipment, what's provided. It will govern, kind of examples of what web browsing is acceptable, and then it can also be a place where things like your mobile device policy can be included as well. So how are mobile devices handled is, a BYOD approach where staff can bring their own devices and connect them to work resources. Is that permitted? Are employees provided with business resources? And kind of how that line is drawn. One of the things that often comes up is just how do you handle reimbursements for that? And I know past couple of years, Community IT has kind of changed how we handle that because of some IRS guidelines. So we now provide a technology stipend, and it's just provided to all employees, and that's a taxable benefit that we get, because the other alternate would be for employees to get reimbursed for the portion of the phone that they use for business purposes, and that becomes an administrative headache. So as a policy, we've chosen to go that route. I do think in the nonprofit space in particular, the pendulum is swinging back a little bit from being like really permissive about mobile devices where, hey, staff, isn't it great that you can use your phone to get your email, to a position where people are being a little bit more thoughtful about what it means to have company data on personal assets. And I think because the technology has also improved so that it's a little bit easier to implement a mobile device management policy where there are more tight controls over what data is allowed on phones, having it, the ability for that phone to be wiped if it's lost or if an employee is offboarded, and kind of so on and so forth. So I think, mobile device policy I would put on there as, a higher priority policy to have and can be nested under that acceptable use policy. The second bullet point is around a data policy, and this is a fairly broad topic, and is kind of broad intentionally, just because as we've seen more and more information go to the cloud, the cloud doesn't necessarily change things in terms of, not needing to think about it or not needing to have a policy, but it kind of opens up more opportunities for questions to be asked, since the data, again, is no longer in the server closet down the hall, so we don't really have data residency issues. It could be on the web somewhere. So it presents kind of more opportunities for questions around, how data should be managed, what controls do we want to have around that, what expectations do we have of our vendors, and kind of, what other kind of information do we need to layer on so that we understand our data, and not just file data, but also, database systems, digital assets like pictures. And so thinking about, data broadly, as opposed to just, oh, where are my files stored, where are my emails stored, because that data can be stored in lots and lots of different systems, not just systems that deal with storing discrete files. I have identity and account policy as a separate line item as well. Again, identity, and this becomes a lot more important because we were talking about identity, not just your Active Directory account that you use to log into your computer, but we're talking about now your identity that is now used to log into to Salesforce, to Hootsuite, to Twitter, to your HR system online. So this identity now exists and travels with you, within, not just within the bounds of the network, but across the whole, kind of cloud and web application sphere, where you are accessing systems, many different systems. And so each of those systems, kind of creates an opportunity or a window for data loss to occur, for systems to be compromised. And so having a clear sense of what expectations to have around managing an identity, what security policies do we want to apply, can help focus on can help focus an organization on thinking about that much more broadly than kind of a single account. And then finally, I do have HIPAA on here. There were some questions around, what compliance rules am I required to follow as an organization? And I would say typically nonprofit organizations, may not have many, kind of quote unquote, legally mandated compliance requirements that they need to follow. The big exception would be, HIPAA and PCI compliance. And so, fortunately, nonprofits don't have the same kind of overhead required for certain, mandated security controls that other organizations do. It's very interesting. I think in a lot of ways, nonprofits are certainly leading edge when it comes to cloud adoption. But at the same time, I think nonprofits are kind of way behind the curve when it comes to security. I had the opportunity to attend the RSA conference in San Francisco back in February, and in that the other attendees were all chief information security officers and other kind of people whose job it was entirely to work on security. And whenever the topic came around of who's concerned about data security losing a laptop, nobody was concerned about that. Who's concerned about a user password being compromised, nobody was concerned about it. And it wasn't that they were concerned about that specific activity happening. They weren't concerned because they had compensating controls in place. So nobody's concerned about losing a laptop because they had already implemented encryption, and that was a universal standard. They weren't concerned about somebody's password getting compromised because they had already implemented two-factor authentication as a requirement. So, and they've done that kind of in response to a lot of regulation and compliance requirements. And that same standard, typically does not apply for most nonprofit organizations. So it is hard to implement some of these kind of stronger security controls because there isn't a mandate to do so. And so, while we'd hope organizations are taking a more proactive stance in terms of improving organization security, it can be a challenge if there's no kind of stick to force that compliance. I talked a little bit about the data privacy in the previous slide, and one way that we often think about that is doing things through a CIA framework, or a confidentiality and integrity and availability framework, kind of categorize data and help to provide some kind of a rigorous classification against kind of where information should be stored and what other controls may need to be placed around it. So again, here we see we've got some things that are sensitive data like medical records, and then we can categorize those as saying medical records have a high level or high degree of confidentiality, a high degree of integrity, and a high degree of availability, and we can create IT systems that can support that requirement. Whereas maybe program management, maybe that's a low degree of confidentiality, a moderate degree of integrity, and a moderate degree of availability. And as a result, different IT systems can be put in place to support that framework. And again, as much as we're talking about developing IT policy, that really should come first. So as opposed to thinking of the technology and then working backwards, it's preferred to think about the policy and the data first, and then find technology solutions to meet those organizational requirements. So in our previous webinar, we talk a lot more about the CIA triad and some different ways to view data from that perspective. So I think it is a helpful tool, and I did want to include it as part of this presentation as a way to provide a framework for thinking about the data and the systems that these policies are going to be applied to. So in terms of implementing an IT security policy, this is something that needs to follow a fairly well-defined process, and it's a process that really needs to start with senior management, quote unquote, the board level support or mandate. And this is an important distinction to make, because IT policies kind of developed by IT for IT, I think are often not very effective. And there can be viewed across the organization as a land grab or a control grab by the IT department, and kind of unnecessary. So I think our position would be that these IT policies really benefit having executive or board level sponsorship to kind of ensure that they are kind of supporting the broader organizational goals. And again, that's kind of what the IT policy is for, is to really support the organization itself as it works to achieve its mission. It's not kind of in service just to the IT department. So once the senior management or the board is kind of engaged in that process, then the process can begin to develop a draft policy. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of great templates and resources out there. The SANS ones I think are very good and kind of thorough and well written. But I will say a lot of the policy templates out there are, big. I mean, they're kind of big and maybe excessively comprehensive for nonprofits. And so while I think they're a good reference point, I think organizations would be much better off to kind of look at those, consult with those, but instead kind of develop their policy kind of in-house from the ground up, as opposed to adopting an existing policy template and working from there. Because I do think the nonprofit culture and work style, work habit, is different than the enterprise where a lot of these templates come from. And so you'd be much better off starting from scratch to kind of talk through what's important for your organization, and then maybe do a cross-check with some of these larger, more elaborate policies to make sure that you aren't missing things. But starting organically as opposed to shoehorning a big policy to fit your organization. I think in terms of an overall process, so flowing from that draft policy, I think then that can go to colleague support or program support. So for example, if there's going to be some data management or data retention policies, that may need to have support by other folks in the organization to say, hey, we're concerned about we've got files on our file server that are 20 years old, and we think we can have a data retention policy that says, hey, after a program is over, we only need to keep it for 7 years. And so enlisting the colleagues to kind of refine and create those policies is going to go a long way into the overall success and adoption of the policies in general. So once the support, I think, has been enlisted for these policies, then we can kind of move into, okay, how are we going to monitor these things? And I think this is, again, another area where, smaller organizations with not as many resources, it is hard to, kind of really rigorously monitor a lot of these policies and systems over time. And so I think that's why, in general, organizations are better off being a little bit more general in terms of their definitions and try to anticipate how much time it is going to take to effectively monitor and manage these policies once they have been implemented. So again, some guidance could be, start small and work from there, as opposed to defining a very rigorous and extensive policy that's going to require a lot of management and overhead to deal with and support. And then finally, once we kind of have some boundaries around how are we going to monitor these policies, then you can move into an implementation phase, and we'll talk a little bit more about some different approaches for implementation as we move along. So again, as I mentioned, we have some important considerations to kind of think about as policies are being developed, and then I think kind of coming back to this first concept of policies require executive support. This should not be a bottom-up approach. This is one area where it is important to have a top-down approach to policy development, and again, starting with the policy first. It is really interesting to see all of the new and amazing stuff that a lot of these cloud solutions can do in terms of, applying policy tags and retention tools and, all the features that are available out there. But it's important that, the technology that you're using now does not drive the policy decisions that your organization is making. These are, the decisions that are being made around IT policy, are not technology they're not first and foremost technology solutions, they're organizational policy decisions, and then you can find the appropriate technology to meet and support those requirements. Again, determine level of investment to meet policy requirements. Again, I think this is another area where I see the nonprofit sector being a bit behind kind of the for-profit world, because again, there's often not a compliance or need to do that. You don't need to spend money on these, email retention systems or data mining solutions, and so organizations kind of don't make those choices. So it is important to understand the level of investment required if an organization is saying, hey, we're going to keep all of our data for all time, or we want to have a very sophisticated classification system to keep program emails for 5 years, but legal emails for 7 years, and we're going to keep other email for a year, and we're going to have all these kind of overhead and requirements for data that we manage. The other thing I think that's important to note, and I think it struck me especially looking at our webinar from a few years ago, is to recognize that IT policies are living documents, and so a lot has changed in the years, and the policy that was written for IT, a handful of years ago, may not be relevant anymore. There are references to technology that's no longer in use. There may be IT systems that are no longer in use. Your organization's data, may have moved to, 2 or 3 systems from the original writing of the policy, and so I think, it's important to be able to recognize and have a process or system in place for an annual review and annual checkup, even if it's going to be a total rewrite, but just a course correction to determine if the IT policies that are in place are still meeting the current recommendations and best practices. And something that we see, we kind of have evolving security best practices in terms of how we think about providing, a good balance of security at our organizations, kind of balanced with, kind of overhead and hassle in terms of that implementation. We already talked about a fair amount, starting from scratch or starting for the template. There are a lot of great templates, but I think, again, if you do have the time, starting from scratch is going to give you a better and more tailored solution for your organization, as opposed to, something you're kind of shoehorning And again, we talked about developing a monitoring strategy, and then finally ongoing training. IT kind of security, I think, requires constant vigilance, and the ongoing training is something that I think needs to be a much more proactive and interactive approach than kind of just the official employee handbook that sits on the shelf that reminds people to not go to websites that they shouldn't, that aren't required for their work. So the good news is that there are a number of good kind of online training resources that are available that can help to support and supplement your IT security policy, particularly when it comes to good password policies, good safe web browsing habits, and kind of other aspects of kind of good end user behavior. So ongoing training really needs to be thought of as the policy is being developed, and it needs to be something that is envisioned to be interactive rather than kind of stuck in the employee handbook that doesn't get read beyond the first week of the job as somebody is getting onboarded. So once we've kind of gone through this process and we get to the organizational adoption, there still are a few more decisions to be made in terms of determining the implementation approach. If you're going to do a kind of a big bang, like, hey, we're implementing new IT policy, and that means X, Y, and Z. So is that something that's going to happen all at once, or is that something that's going to be more of a phased deployment approach? So I think the good guidance around this, particularly from SANS, is to say, hey, you've worked really hard on your IT policy, and we want to go ahead and just implement it kind of all at one time. So we have one end user impacting event, and we can kind of work through that, as opposed to a slow and steady drip of kind of maybe behavioral changes that staff need to be made. Again, I think this is going to be driven largely by an organization's culture in terms of what's going to make the most sense. And so, as much as you can, I do think, this big bang approach is probably preferable, particularly if it's going to involve a lot of user change. So it's good to, have a build up. You can focus the trainings around that, implement your policy, and mostly, we're talking about things that'll impact end users potentially, like, password changes, password policies, maybe changes to your mobile device management approach. These are things that you're probably well served by doing it all at once, after a small deployment or a small pilot group, to make sure that everything's working as effectively, and then you can go to a broader deployment. Again, it's important to have a realistic date. It's not something really you want to rush, and it's not something you want to drag out and never have an implementation timeline. So set a realistic date for that adoption and forward with with urgency when time comes. And obviously some issues. Nothing going to be perfect. There may be situations weren't anticipated during the creation of the policy, and it's okay. But it is important to acknowledge that there are going to be some challenges and to plan for incorporating that feedback, maybe up and modifying the policy, and then moving on from there. So when talking about specifically our approach to policies, I'll kind of share how we think about things. I'd appreciate any comments or feedback folks have. So I would say, in general, our approach to policies is generally permissive. So if you look at SANS documentation, there's kind of a couple of different levels. So there's promiscuous, where kind of anything goes, you can do whatever you want. There's permissive, which is kind of generally allow things. There's conservative, where kind of the default is to deny things, and then there's really restrictive, and so that would be you can't do anything except with approval. So that may be more appropriate for military or NSA or whatever. But so in general, we find that kind of a generally permissive organizational policy suits the nonprofit culture best, because we kind of trust the staff that work at our organizations, and we aren't going to invest as much in kind of the overhead apparatus to really monitor and manage a more restrictive policy. So again, while our default is generally to allow kind of behaviors, we do typically say no administrative access. So again, for staff, for end users, they should not be administrators on their computer. We would require good passwords and multi-factor authentication. So the multi-factor, again, this is kind of a thing where this represents an evolution in our thinking of security policy and saying, yeah, good passwords are great, but multi-factor now, I think through the advent of the cloud and a lot of these services moving to the cloud, multi-factor becomes a lot easier to implement and to manage and to enforce. And so this is a great security improvement that we can take advantage of, and we want to do that. Again, we want to encourage security awareness, because we're not investing in really sophisticated technology solutions to protect users from, and oftentimes protect users from themselves. We want to make sure that users are empowered to kind of make good technology solutions. So we, have a security awareness training tool that we use internally. And, I think it's good to, kind of keep, repeating and lifting up security, as a topic that we all need to be aware of, and kind of each individual, has a big impact on the overall security of the organization. So, then there's some other basic things like, we're going to require antivirus. We still think it's a good idea. We actually, have a kind of a sophisticated, that predictive intelligence. We use that kind of that top layer that maybe, not within reach for every organization, but that's a solution that could be implemented as well. And again, we're requiring weekly patching. Means you have to reboot your computer every week. That might be something that's a challenge at your organization to tell people, yes, you're gonna have to save all of those 15 documents that you have on your desktop. You gotta close your computer. Your computer's gonna be rebooted once a week. We know security patches, are effective, and that's how these vulnerabilities are being spread. And so we need to be really proactive about patching. So weekly patching and backups for everything. And again, I think this is an area where the cloud has made this a little bit more challenging. It can seem like, hey, it's out of sight, out of mind. My data's in the cloud, I don't really have to worry about it anymore. But again, kind of coming back to your policy, if you have a good policy in place that says, hey, we need to have data in a system that we manage, that we control, that we have access to all the time, then that would mean that you wouldn't have your data in just one cloud system, because if there's an issue with the vendor, the data got corrupted somehow, some other issue, that could be a real problem if the approach of the organization was, hey, we're completely trusting in our cloud infrastructure provider. So maybe backing up to another cloud may have some other redundancy. But again, I think that's an example of where your policy can really help to inform some of the behaviors, the technology solutions to support those, services that you're using. Again, we're going to monitor and audit logins. I think, again, this is another thing that the cloud really provides. If you're, back in the quote unquote old days of an on-premise file server, unless your organization has invested in some really sophisticated technology tools, it's very hard to say, oh, I know Johan accessed this file on this date from this computer. Like, it's just very, very difficult to do. But now, through a lot of cloud-based services, it's really easy to say, oh, I see Johan accessed, the webinar planning document, 3 days ago and made some changes. It just, moving into cloud services makes the auditing and reporting for these services a lot easier. And so it's easier to keep tabs on things, to know when things look funny or are going wrong. And I would say, the other thing, I guess, to that is we're not typically monitoring web browsing. And again, I think this is also a good expectation to be setting for, for clients and for the organizations about understanding your IT policy and understanding how it's being implemented. We do often have situations where organizations will come to us to be like, oh, I need to know, what Bob was doing on the web, 5 days ago. And the short answer is that we don't monitor web traffic, and you don't have the technology tool in place to support that. So if monitoring web traffic is important to your organization, it's important to have a technology that supports that policy. So in general, we're not doing that. There are, there are a lot of technology solutions that will meet that requirement, but kind of by default, that's not something that we find, is as valuable as, focusing on some of these other areas. And again, kind of the final concept here, and it really is a concept, is that we're typically following a defense in depth approach. as opposed to a view. And if you're in an office, that could be, you've got your firewall, you've got your segmented network, you've got no administrative permission, you've got web filtering, you've got spam filtering. So that's kind of an example of defense in depth. So saying if the web filter doesn't get it, the desktop antivirus might protect you. So that's kind of a defense in depth model. And I would say we are moving towards a little bit more of a kind of assume breach mentality, where we're going to set up and design systems that assume that maybe an attacker is already in the network. And so if you're in that mentality, then it means you're relying a lot more on encryption, so that even if somebody has access to your computer, they can't actually see or manage any, kind of get access to any data, because that data is all encrypted, and that encryption key is kind of only available to the kind of known and approved end user. So in general, that's kind of the guiding policy that is helping to inform how we are implementing these IT policies. I think it is interesting to see, particularly how other organizations, particularly organizations that think a lot about security, talk about this stuff. And so this is Microsoft Cybersecurity and Defense Strategy. And so this is kind of their stated policy document and framework that they use for thinking about IT security at Microsoft. So, I think it is very interesting. They've got these 3 top-level things about investing in your platform, investing in your instrumentation, and investing in your people, and talking about all the different areas that require focus. So I think the things to highlight, and I think the things that are relevant in our space for whatever 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 person organizations are in terms of investing in your platform, talking about maintaining a well-documented inventory of your assets. So knowing where does data live in your organization, what's important to us, what's sensitive data, and having that documented ahead of time so that you can apply policies to that data. Where most attacks could be prevented with timely patches and antivirus. And again, we're seeing this kind of over and over again, where unpatched systems or out of maintenance systems are compromised. And then again here, employ multi-factor authentication to strengthen protection of accounts and devices. And this is something that we've started to recommend and implement more and more, is multi-factor authentication as part of an identity, as part of that identity account management policy. We want to ensure that there's a good password in place. We want to ensure that that password is protected by multi-factor authentication. If you have attended some of our previous webinars on security, we are seeing many examples of account compromise through a number of different attacks, through spear phishing attacks, through general brute force attacks, both through web-based Office 365 applications, or attacks against terminal servers, stolen credentials. We're kind of seeing the whole gamut of it. And I think, and our reaction has been, oh, well, if two-factor hadn't been in place, we wouldn't have had the security issue to begin with. So again, good patching, good password policy, good account hygiene, multi-factor authentication. These are all really important steps to take. It does require more of the end user. You can't just type in your same 5-character password that you've had since 2003, but it's going to prevent, the organization overall is going to be in a much better state from a security perspective. So it's worth that trade-off to make those changes. And again, I would say that's another reason why, kind of coming back to this IT policy development workflow, it really does need to come from the top. So if the board or the executive director is saying, hey, we really need to make security a priority, and as a result, we need to it's important for this organization that everybody has a good password and two-factor authentication. That's going to go a lot farther than, the IT guy or the IT person or the IT consultant coming in to be like, oh, hey, you really need to have a better password policy. The adoption just isn't as good. I think this middle column, invest in your instrumentation. Again, because I would say in general our approach is rather permissive. It's an acknowledgement that the instrumentation is pretty expensive even now. If you are in Office 365, or if you're in the G Suite cloud, you're already seeing some of the benefits that moving to the cloud gets you in terms of some more sophisticated analysis. You may get a notification, hey, we think your account has been logged into from another location that doesn't make sense. We've blocked it. Here's how to get back in. Those are all, I think, benefits to take advantage of. But if you're still living in a largely on-prem world, it's really hard to add that level of sophistication. So that's a kind of a note on the instrumentation. And then again, invest in your people. And I think the thing to highlight here, again, least privileged administrative access. That's why we don't want to have folks with local administrative access, even if it means they have to go through an extra step to install software. It creates a much more secure environment. And again, something that we try to do here is using lessons learned to gain value from every major incident. So whenever we encounter a security incident at one of our clients, it's something our incident response policy basically involves me in as part of that response, and then we turn that feedback around to kind of share with the rest of our organization, and maybe make available newsletters or other things so that we can help to learn from those scenarios and hopefully prevent that and maybe other scenarios from reoccurring in the future. And again, finally, like educate, empower, and enlist users as a way to protect business data. Again, there's this kind of new concept or newer concept called the human firewall. Each individual person, they're kind of their own good firewall, and as many security tools and policies you have in place, if they're going to click on that link that comes through, or if they're browsing to websites that have a bunch of malware in it, it's really hard to protect against everything all the time. So if as much as we can empower and educate our users about good security practices and good kind of computer hygiene, I think the better off that we're going to be overall. So again, kind of coming back as we kind of come to the tail end of the presentation, kind of talking about where to invest. This can be really daunting, especially if you're an organization that's just getting started. You don't really have much to go on. Where do you focus? And I would say there's probably three things to focus on. So one is just, starting with that acceptable use policy. In general, you may already have something similar to this or a beginning of this in your employee handbook. So that's a great place to build on. And that can be used really as a framework to link to and incorporate other policies into the organization. The next thing that I have is actually, it's not the passwords, but it's a clear backup and data retention policy. And the reason I have this second is because kind of our first reaction whenever there's a data, some kind of a security vulnerability or security breach, is often, data has been lost or compromised in some sort. And so if an organization, kind of hasn't had a well-defined or well-articulated data retention or data management policy, it can be very difficult to kind of recover from that. So, somebody, something happens, somebody's email contacts are lost or deleted. Well, if we haven't kind of defined like, hey, organizational contacts are really a critical resource, we need to make sure that's backed up. If that's only discovered after the data has been lost, then that's a really hard thing to recover from. So I think understanding your organization's data and having a clear articulation of what's important, where does it reside, how are we protecting it, is really the next step that organizations need to take. Once that's been defined, then I think certainly we can move on to having a strong identity and account policy that really governs the policies around passwords and single sign-on and account access. That those are good things to have too. And so those, I would say, would be the first 3 things to focus on. And again, aligning the technology with policy. These are all decisions where the policy comes first, and you can find technology and technology solutions to help support those policies that have already been defined. So again, acceptable use policy, talk about things like, in general, we find that these acceptable use policies say things like computers are for organizational use. They're not for kind of personal use, and there's no expectation of privacy. We want to encourage good computer stewardship. And again, this acceptable use policy is really an umbrella policy that can help reference other policies, and so that can be kind of your framework that you can build off of. Again, the data policy, we're talking about data, I don't know, big D data, data in wherever it may reside, and so that may be your your email blast system, it may be your CRM, but kind of data broadly. Where does that exist? It's not just files anymore. And use that data classification, the CIA triad, to help provide some additional perspective on that. Is all data super confidential, high degree of integrity, always has to be up? Yeah, maybe so. So let's find technology solutions that can help meet those requirements. And again, define the retention requirements. This one I think is tough. Storage is cheap. The time to figure out what data we need to keep around, that requires a lot of kind of person hours to kind of sort through and figure out. And so this can be a hard one to say, yeah, we are going to actually go through and purge data that we haven't accessed or used in 7 years, or we are going to be pretty assertive about cleaning out our mailboxes because we're concerned about what happens if that email gets compromised. So data retention can really help drive some of those decisions. And then finally, identity account policy. The password policy is probably the most contentious of all issues, and I know we've worked with organizations kind of for months and months and months to make a change from having a 7-character minimum to an 8-character minimum. So I know I don't want to kind of undersell how big these changes can be in an organization. So this is our current best practice, being an 8-character password minimum. We want passwords to be changed every 90 days. We want to have account lockouts to help prevent against slowing down brute force attacks. And when possible, we want to have 2-factor for cloud-based solutions. Ideally, we're also doing single sign-on. We talked about single sign-on in a previous webinar. So instead of remembering or using a password manager to remember, the 15 to 20 different passwords that you use, you can use a single sign-on solution to have a single password, and all those systems are authenticating against that single, kind of directory. And that's a secure password with a 2nd factor, and then we can kind of manage and audit and report in one location for all the applications, as opposed to needing to do audit reporting against 20 different websites. And there's some other things that I think have been best practices for a long time, but again, it's just worth mentioning. Renaming your default admin accounts, having complex service account passwords. So we've certainly seen accounts like copier or scanner with passwords that haven't been changed in years, and so being mindful of how those accounts are created and maintained is an important step in this overall identity and account policy. So we do have a few minutes for questions, and I want to have some time to answer questions that were that people chatted in as we went throughout this presentation.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Matt. That was excellent. One point of clarification, no pun intended. You had mentioned it's important to have a clear backup and data policy, and I was wondering if you could just elaborate on what you mean by clear.
Sure. I think what I mean by clear is an organization has an accurate understanding of where their data lives. So we have file data. Here's where the file data lives. We have email data. Here's where the email data lives, and then have an understanding of if that data was lost or compromised or cryptoed. What do we need? Like what do we need, or what do we expect? Maybe is more a better word, to be able to get that data back. Do we expect to be able to get all that data back? Within a couple of hours? Do we expect to be able to recover a file that was deleted 5 years ago? Do we expect to be able to, recover, in a database, like certain records if they were deleted? And I guess like a specific, so I guess maybe a specific case that I can think of is, if an organization maybe doesn't have a well documented kind of data inventory system, what could happen is, a system gets compromised, maybe the server crashes, and we go in and say, oh, okay, well, we have a backup of this data. Here's the folder. We're going to restore the data in that folder, and then we come to learn that, oh, well, the organization, this user was actually storing, data in this other location that wasn't part of the official, kind of quote unquote backup system. And so I think that helps to, if it's not on, and often organizations, will say, we're backing up the network data. And if it's on your computer, it's gone. But I would kind of take that to say, well, let's just make sure that, all the data that's on the network that is assumed to be backed up is in fact backed up. And so again, it's kind of checking those expectations to say, here's my expectation. Let's have a conversation with IT. Hey, I expect to be able to, recover the deleted file, that this person deleted a year ago. Can I actually do that? And so you can kind of walk through those scenarios to kind of test those assumptions that the technology solution, is in fact living up to your expectations.
So it would be so the data policy is a combination of a data asset inventory combined with availability requirements, recoverability requirements, and a specification of the systems that are providing that functionality.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's accurate. I think, the backup and disaster recovery, plan, or the business continuity plan, will often make reference to, some kind of data inventory list, and there might be additional dimensions of data, that are added when we talk about, maybe the backup and disaster recovery plan. But again, it's important to have that inventory so that there's a common understanding about, what is our organizational data, where does it live, how do we, and then you can kind of go from there. How are we backing it up? How are we retaining it? What happens if, we lose access to it?
Mm-hmm. Great. We have another well, actually, there have been a number of questions about templates or samples that could be used. And I think you addressed that pretty well early on. SANS publishes a guideline, but I think really the most effective policy is going to be one that is consistent with the other policies that an organization already has. And you're better off working within the existing policy framework for your organization, rather than trying to shoehorn a template that's in a completely different format. And I think that gets to the policy adoption process, that you outlined earlier in the presentation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that the policy templates are great kind of reference checks to make sure that you're covering all your bases. But I would say that in general, I think the policy templates that are out there are very exhaustive, and so you'll probably spend more time kind of throwing out things than you do, kind of adding to it.
Mm-hmm. There are a couple questions about web-based, custom-built web-based systems, website redesigns. To what extent do you see IT security policies sort of extending out to things like websites, social media accounts, things that are maybe not traditionally considered part of the purview of the IT department?
I mean, I do think that, kind of a good, kind of, again, coming back to this idea of like data, kind of your data policy, and that would extend maybe to your data security. I think is relevant, particularly when you're working with additional vendors where you're providing information to. I remember one specific example where an organization, I think they were using Salesforce as their CRM, like a lot of other organizations, and they were looking for a vendor. They were looking for a vendor to like do some mailings, right? So they wanted to, give them access to their Salesforce database, generate a bunch of mailings, send it, and they found kind of through their contract review process that they had a couple different vendors, or two vendors that they were looking at. One would actually kind of essentially take a copy of their data. And then run all the processes kind of from this copy of the data, and they would kind of quote unquote have it on their network. And then the other vendor, essentially would be able to look at the data to run the reports, but they wouldn't actually kind of keep or retain any of that. And so like in that case, the organization, because of their data policy, said, no, we need to kind of keep tight control around our organizational information. And so we can't use a vendor who is going to have a copy of our data on their system, even if it's just to kind of do work that we, say that they can do. So I think that's kind of an example. So again, if you're doing a website, you're providing a lot of information kind of to or through this website vendor or developer, it's important to understand what are your data boundaries around the information that's being provided. Is it going to kind of leave your control? Is it going to be accessed by an entity that you may not, expect to be able to access in that way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great consideration. I like that concept of data boundaries as a way of thinking about where your data might go, how you want to control it. There have been a couple of questions about specific tools. A question about best type of firewall for home environments, a question about hardware firewalls versus software firewalls, a question about the best antivirus or anti-malware package. I was wondering if you could we only have a few minutes left, but if you could speak broadly about how IT policy can help inform decisions about types of security solutions or the selection of various security solutions.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and I think, everybody wants to kind of make sure they're having the, kind of the quote unquote best technology, to protect their organization. I do think it's important to understand that there is no silver bullet. There is no kind of perfect technology solution that is going to be right all the time. And I think that is one of the really challenging things in IT and IT security is that, you're playing defense, you kind of have to be right 100% all the time. And it's the one unpatched system that can be compromised and bring down the rest of the network. So that's why I think in general IT policy should be rather broad and kind of non-technology specific. So it may be appropriate to say if you're working in the office, we expect to have a firewall that's going to be filtering traffic, and we're going to be blocking known threats, and leave it at that. And then it's kind of up to kind of working with IT to do a vendor evaluation to say what's going to be the best firewall for us right now. And I think there's now probably more than ever what makes the best firewall may not be just how it performs technically and kind of blocking threats, but how effective is it at reporting? What's the user interface? How has that experience been? And so I think for us personally, we've started to use Meraki a lot more as a security appliance, and I think it's a good firewall in terms of its technical capabilities, but the real benefit is that it's really easy to use and administer, and we get a lot of insight out of it. And so as opposed to maybe some other solutions that maybe, I don't know, maybe even were more superior technically, understanding how they were working, getting reporting out of that was a lot harder. So so being more general, yes, computers need to have antivirus, yes, we need to have a firewall, working with trusted partners to find out what's the best solution for your needs right there. There could be there could be different options depending on other requirements of the organization.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. We are now at time, so I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. There was a couple more questions that came in, and I'll leave the webinar open for just a second and respond to those through the chat tool. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you very much, Matt, for your time. This was a fantastic, very interesting webinar, a great topic, and we intend to publish a little bit more on our blog on this topic. So keep your eyes open for that, and we'll send a link out to that, as well as a link to the recording and slides for today's webinar. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Matt. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.